Good Tuesday, everybody. Rob O'Connor here from RobVenoSports.com, and it is time for our Week 2 early look at the college football card, and we will also take a look back at what we just saw in a crazy and very exciting Week 1 of the college football season. And, of course, we can't do all of that without the founder of RobVenoSports.com, Rob Veno. Rob, how are you this afternoon?
Hey, I'm doing great, Rob. How about yourself?
Doing well. It was quite an exciting Week 1 that we saw. I guess we'll just start and take a look back at what we saw in terms of some big upsets. I mean, Houston, Wisconsin, Texas all beat teams ranked in the top 10. Let's start with those, Rob. What are your thoughts on those upsets and how it will affect each of the programs as they head into the season a little further?
Yeah, well, I mean, if we start with, let's start with Wisconsin upsetting LSU in a game where the line went crazy. The betting money drove LSU all the way to a minus 12.5 point favorite by closing time off of that 8.5 opener. I think everybody expected it would be difficult for Wisconsin. You and I, in last week's early week look ahead, Rob, on Tuesday, we had kind of summed up the problems for Wisconsin in that game. The losses, the personnel losses, big one on the offensive line, lose their leading tackler, middle linebacker, have a senior starting quarterback in Bart Houston who had not started a game in college football. And yet, despite all of that, go into Lambeau Field, kind of in their backyard, but not necessarily Madison, and beat LSU, a team where the only real question mark coming in was the quarterback, Brandon Jennings. Is he going to be good enough this season to lead LSU to a potential college football playoff, one of those 4 spots, or was he going to be inconsistent as he's been throughout his career, and would LSU struggle? And we got the latter. We got the LSU struggling. Wisconsin's defense was terrific in that game. If you look at the final stat sheet, you see Wisconsin outgains LSU by 82 total yards. LSU held to just 257 total yards. I think bigger than that, Rob, they only had 50 plays run on offense in that game. That's very, very few. And, you know, I think you and I and anybody who watched that game, we can see that LSU remains very unimaginative on offense in a day and age where college football offensively is played, you know, vertically, horizontally, using every inch of space on the field, spread people out, get matchup advantages. LSU still, you know, kind of cavemanish on the offensive side, and Wisconsin's defense certainly took advantage. Huge win for Wisconsin, big blow for LSU. Certainly then when you lose as a double-digit favorite, that's a major loss. That goes the same for Oklahoma, who, as you mentioned earlier, lost to Houston. You know, is there a better answer to the Big 12 than what Houston gave by beating Oklahoma? Houston wants a spot in that conference. Certainly there's an easier road to a college football playoff if you're in a Power 5 conference than there is from where they sit right now in the AAC. Houston went out and kind of matched Oklahoma stride for stride early on and then took the lead. And once they took the lead, they never looked back. Their second half defensive performance against Oklahoma was very, very impressive. Held Oklahoma at bay. Greg Ward Jr., his usual spectacular self. Houston gains 410 yards in that contest. They have a plus 20 play advantage in that one, 80-60. Convert on 52, almost 53% of their first down. So a lot to like about Houston. Once again on a neutral field, like Wisconsin, in their backyard, but not their home field. Played at NRG, the home of the Houston Texans, and Oklahoma, despite the fact that they had an early lead, couldn't hang on and couldn't retaliate once they got behind. That's a devastating loss, I think, for Bob Stoops. You have Ohio State coming in Week 3. They're coming to Norman. And we saw what Ohio State did in Week 1. So for the Oklahoma Sooners, to lose this opener and potentially, they're probably going to be a small favorite, but if they do lose to Ohio State, they're out of the college playoff picture before the season is even a quarter of the way through, right? So that's a big loss for Oklahoma, huge win for Houston. Their story, the opposite side of that coin, they now have a chance to go ahead and run the table and, find themselves in New Year's Day 6 game.
I guess, Rob, the question on that one would be, how realistic do you think it is that Houston will run the table? And then if they actually do run the table and they're undefeated, is there any scenario in which they would get left out of the 4-team playoff?
Yeah, well, I think that there's probably a lot of scenarios where they would get left out of the 4-team playoff, Rob, even with an undefeated record. It's just hard when the committee sits in, and let's say you have 3 power conference filling up those 4 seats either with an undefeated record or a 1-loss team. They're going to get the nod over an undefeated Houston. And then there's always the potential for a 2-loss SEC team to even get the nod over Houston. So it's difficult because it's subjective, and it's up to that committee who they believe are the 4 best teams, and Houston's not going to play a heck of a lot of good competition in the AAC West. Their best game could be when they play for the AAC championship game, should they, and then you're probably looking at South Florida as your opponent, or maybe Temple as your opponent, and maybe that would be your most impressive win. But when you come from a conference and a division especially where you play every single team in your division, and the division is loaded with SMU and Tulsa and Tulane, and the best team inside your division next to you is probably Navy, it's hard. Your strength of schedule just doesn't match up if you're Houston. They can always fall back on this Oklahoma game, provided Oklahoma finishes the year. If Oklahoma finishes as a 1-loss team, it certainly is bigger than if Oklahoma loses to Ohio State and then maybe loses one Big 12 game, a 3-loss Oklahoma team, and then this victory doesn't look as big. So I think there's a lot of scenarios where Houston could still get left out of the 4-team playoff, but, to get to the New Year's Day 6 is a big deal as well. So it's another reason why that team really needs to get into a power conference. Tom Herman has that program on the move, and I know that they would rather be in a power conference with a better chance to get a seat at the playoff table.
Now, before we move on to the Texas-Notre Dame game, let's just backtrack real quick. The one question I had for you from the Wisconsin-LSU loss is you talked about what a big step forward it is for the Wisconsin program. What does this do to Les Miles? Puts him right back on the hot seat. Brandon Harris is going to have to do something to improve his play if LSU is going to have any chance in a very deep SEC West this year. What do you see LSU being able to do after this game moving forward?
Yeah, just listening to you there jogged my memory. I kind of combined last year's LSU's quarterbacks in my analysis, didn't I? I called them Brandon Jennings, and that's a combination of Brandon Harris and Anthony Jennings, who is now the quarterback at UL Lafayette, who we saw Saturday. But Brandon Harris, absolutely. We see today reports that boosters and alumni are taking up a collection to buy out Les Miles' contract and send them packing. So I guess that's what it tells you about the way that the fan base feels at this point in time about Les Miles. It's just amazing to me, Rob, that, as pro-style and as traditional a head coach as Nick Saban is, he went out 2 years ago, maybe it was 3 years ago, and got Lane Kiffin to come in and be his offensive coordinator to spice things up on the offensive side because he had had enough of Gus Malzahn winning the West and going to national title games. And he had seen enough of these spread offenses across the country. Even though he's a traditional coach, he wanted to have his offense have some of those elements as well, didn't want to be boring. Les Miles had the same opportunity. He's got Cam Cameron down there, a former NFL offensive coordinator who's running this team like a traditional pro-style NFL offense. You've got to make the change nowadays. Offensively, you can't be predictable. Just because you have Leonard Fournette doesn't mean that on 1st and 10 you can run the football, 2nd and 8 you can run the football, especially against a good defensive team and a well-coached team like Wisconsin. And then on 3rd and in bad down and distance situations, just basically be in a punch spot because you can't convert 3rd downs when your back is up against the wall and the yardage is more than, 3 yards. So, I mean, it's surprising to me that Les Miles has not gone out and done something to diversify that offense. It does them no good to have all these NFL-ready wide receivers. Like I said earlier, it does them no good to have Leonard Fournette. When you're playing lesser foes and you can just run them over, line up, and physically be better, that's one thing. But, hey, when you run into a team like Wisconsin that can match you physically and that plays with a little more intensity, you're in trouble. So I think from that perspective, I can understand the fan frustration, and there's got to be something done at LSU. Something's got to be shaken up. Now, we say that heading into week 2, for all we know, LSU could rattle off 11 straight victories here. Off of what we saw last week, it doesn't seem likely, but it doesn't mean last week is the way their entire season is going to play out. If they wind up going 11-1.
You look at their schedule, and they have a couple of challenging road games, but not unwinnable. They play on the road against Auburn and against Florida. But if they can win those 2 games, they're probably still a one-loss team going into back-to-back home games against Ole Miss and Alabama, and there's a chance for everything to be well with the world come Saturday night, November 5th, if LSU doesn't lose a game. As you mentioned, it's not looking great now, but if they can fix some things, find a little more creativity, those 2 road games, they're winnable.
No, you're absolutely right, and it's why you can't overreact to week one results. As a company, we fielded a question yesterday about the LSU power rating from week 1 to week 2 remaining the same. Fans out there believe that you're just automatically supposed to drop LSU. I know that's the way that the top 25 polls work, but in the case of where we rate LSU from a power ratings perspective, my power ratings made that game against Wisconsin, LSU, only a 5-point favorite, not a 12.5-point favorite. If you have them as a 12.5-point favorite, you need to adjust. But the line that we had between LSU and Wisconsin means that, basically the power ratings had gauged these 2 teams properly to begin with. And so no adjustment necessary. You can't just off of week 1 project that the week 1 result is how an entire season is going to play out. So like we said, LSU could go 11-1 for all we know, and you'll look back at this game and think, wow, how we overreacted. It happens every year, Rob, that teams, and you know this as well as anybody, that teams, stumble and then turn it around, and what you perceived after one game doesn't necessarily become the reality. So we'll see where they go from here. I think we both know that their success is predicated upon the play of the quarterback. If Brandon Harris doesn't get any better, they're not going to win 11 in a row. If he does progress and the passing game becomes more of a threat and defenses are forced out of the box and you can't creep 11 guys up within 6 yards of the line of scrimmage, then we'll see LSU have better results and perhaps win those 11 in a row.
Well, Rob, I think this is a great segue into our first email question of the day. And if you're listening and have a question, you can email us, robvinosports@gmail.com, and we will do our best to answer your questions throughout the show each and every week this college football season. The question becomes, from a power ranking standpoint, who were your biggest movers to the plus and minus after week 1?
Yeah, and I'll preface this, Rob, by saying that I've been creating power ratings for football and basketball for 24 years now, back to 1992. And, in those early 90s years when I was living out in Las Vegas, you take some lumps and you learn some lessons. And one of the real lessons that I learned in formulating power ratings is you can't just randomly and significantly raise and drop teams right off the bat. So therefore, I was told by somebody in the industry way back when that the best thing to do is figure out what your ceiling would be on how much you could move a team from 1 week to the next. So I create a ceiling, and that's it. No matter how well you perform, you can get the max, or you could get anything from staying the same up to the max. Now, the teams that got the max move upward in power ratings this week, and there's a group of them. I believe there were 9 of them, but I'll list them to you. Army got the maximum power ratings increase this week. Ball State got the maximum power ratings increase. Central Florida, Colorado, Kansas, Old Dominion, Texas El Paso, Tulsa, and Wyoming. Now, right there, it's not a who's who of college football. In fact, I think there's only 2 Power 5 conference teams listed in there, Colorado and Kansas. The rest are non-Power 5 schools. But those teams received a maximum upgrade this week. That would suggest to you that for the most part, they played beyond my opening power rating expectations. Those teams did. So if we take the opposite end of the spectrum and go down and look at the teams who dropped the most, there's 4 of them. The one team that lost the entire limit on what you could lose from a power rating in week 1 was Bowling Green. Bowling Green lost the max. They certainly were never in the contest against Ohio State, lose 77-10. Bowling Green was a team that lost their head coach, Dino Babers. He went to Syracuse. It was a team that only returned, or it is a team that only returned 3 starters to the offense. But, in fairness to them, after watching Bowling Green for the last 4 or 5 years, you kind of get the idea that it's a system team and you just plug and play like all of these other 85 to 90 plays a game teams are. Baylor, Texas Tech, teams like that. Bowling Green kind of fit that mold for the MAC, but it didn't pan out against Ohio State. So they lose a significant amount, the maximum amount off of their power rating. And then 3 teams that came within a half a point of losing the max off of their power rating were Arkansas State, absolutely destroyed by Toledo, a team that took a lot of betting money. Prior to that game, Arkansas State opened 1.5, bet straight up to 4.5. They have a Pittsburgh transfer, Chad Wojcik, playing quarterback, but boy, he did not look anything like Freddie Knighton, the ex-Arkansas State quarterback who has led them to the top of the Sun Belt Conference. Wojcik just didn't look the same as a Knighton-led offense did. No J.D. McKessick this year. So Arkansas State, with their poor home performance against Toledo, drops. Ohio U, who got beat in double overtime, I think it was, by Texas State. They lose all but half of the maximum you can lose. And the third team was last night's loser, Mississippi. And that's, in reaction to where I had the projected line. I thought that Ole Miss had a lot of value. Our line was much lower than what the closing line was and what the odds makers line was. Therefore, Mississippi has to be dropped because they just weren't as good as the power ratings indicated. So there you have it. Those 4 teams, Arkansas State, Mississippi, Ohio U, and Bowling Green, your 4 significant losers this week. And then, of course, we listed the winners already.
And, Rob, one game that we did want to touch on before we move forward is the Notre Dame-Texas game, a phenomenal game Sunday night. They had the spotlight to themselves. I had put Notre Dame on upset alert last week to be on alert that there was a chance they could go down, thought it might be a field goal game either way, and that's exactly what we ended up with. What does this do for the Texas program? It's a much needed shot of energy and really could set them up for a season. And then on the flip side, Notre Dame, how do they recover from this moving forward? And is there any viable path to the four-team playoff for them.
Well, there's a viable path. They have to go out and win at least 10 of their next 11 games, right? Maybe at 11-2, or at 10-2, they'd be under consideration. At 11-1, I think Notre Dame's always under consideration. But they've got to, they put themselves in a spot where they almost have to win out. I think we hit it on the head when we talked last week, Rob, the problems that existed with Notre Dame. They were magnified in that particular game, and none of them have to do with offense. Notre Dame is just fine offensively. Deshaun Kaiser looked fantastic, and his time at quarterback split some time with Malik Zaire. And that when the ground game looked good, the passing game looked good. St. Brown could be, if he continues on, one of the nation's elite receivers and finds his way right into the upper half of the NFL draft. If he continues, he looked that good on Monday night. So, none of the problems are on the offensive side of the football. The problems were on the defensive side. Specifically, I think they still lie in the secondary, Rob. We talked about the issues that they had last season. Those issues carried into this season due to the off-field incident 2 weeks before the season started. Max Redfield, once again, starting safety for this team with a lot of career starts, 20-something career starts under his belt, kicked off the team, dismissed. Another player that was involved in that mix who was going to be out until October because of an injury anyway, but now faces dismissal depending upon, I guess, how the charges go from here. But you saw it evidenced in that game. Shane Buechele hit a couple of big pass plays. You can torch Notre Dame in that secondary. Texas had 16 completed passes in that game. Doesn't sound like a lot, right? 16 completed passes. But those 16 passes went for an average of 17.5 yards. And you can't be successful defensively allowing that, especially when you can't stop a read option style offense either, because when Texas put Tyrone Swoops in the game and Texas went to the running quarterback and some read option, zone read stuff, boy, he picked up a lot of yardage, and the Texas ground game was good. So issues for Notre Dame are on the defensive side of the football. They did lose a lot of talent over there, and certainly the suspensions, dismissals, injuries haven't helped the secondary. We'll see. For Texas, it's a great win, right? But you have to continue to do that. For Texas, you hope that the players don't feel like they've arrived at this point in time just because of one win, because if they feel that way, wait till they get to the Big 12 gauntlet and start playing the teams in their conference. You'll lose 3 or 4 games inside there. There's a lot of good teams in that league that they'll have to play. Baylor, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, TCU. Texas Tech looks dangerous. So Texas has to be consistent with their winning. Otherwise, as high as the fan base is right now, as exciting as the brand of football is, that'll go away real quick if they don't keep winning games. So we'll see. We'll see if they can maintain it. It was a good start, but it needs to be maintained by the Longhorns.
I think something else we should touch base on is quite a few teams in Week 1 tend to schedule some cupcake-type games, bring in an FCS school, pay them some money, and think they're going to get a big win to start the year. That didn't work out so well for a few teams this year. Quite a few FCS teams beat some bigger competition. I mean, I think the biggest one would be Richmond beating Virginia. You also had Northern Iowa beating Iowa State, a disappointing setback for that program. Eastern Washington beats Washington State, and Albany picks up a win. Let's talk a little bit about the FCS winners from Week 1, Rob.
Well, the 3 out of the 4 that you listed there, Rob, for those folks who follow FCS football, by year's end you could be talking about 3 of the top 5 FCS teams. They're all playoff teams. I think they were all top 10 to start the year in FCS rankings. Richmond is an outstanding FCS team. Northern Iowa, a fantastic FCS team. And Eastern Washington, of course, we know them with their red field and their throw the football all over the place mentality year in and year out. Those teams are really, really good. So for Virginia, breaking in brand new systems under head coach Bronco Mendenhall. It's a far cry. I think the only more significant schematic change than what Virginia's going through right now when you go from Mike London's offense to Robert Anai's offense at Virginia. I think the only bigger schematic change across the nation would have been at Tulane, where Willie Fritz and the triple option came in for the Tulane Greenway, taking them from a spread offense, throw it all over the field, to now a triple option. That's a drastic move. Virginia under the same type of learning curve there now with Robert Anai, a guy who, basically wants to be the fastest offense in the country, always has, dates back to his days at Arizona, dates back to his days at BYU. He's played for some of the top spread offensive head coaches, or he's coached under some of the top spread offensive coaches throughout his career. It's hard to get that rolling right away. And even with Kurt Benkert at quarterback, who transferred over from East Carolina and played in Lincoln Riley's system when he was there before he transferred to Oklahoma, even with Benkert at quarterback and having some sort of familiarity with the up-tempo spread, still didn't work out. Richmond was better, wire to wire, 37-20 win. Northern Iowa's a power football team, a very good football team. They hang on and beat Iowa State 25-20. These are games, by the way, Rob, where you expect that these teams could have a little bit of trouble. Now, Mike Leach's Washington State team, you would figure could go toe-to-toe with Eastern Washington and win the football game, but all of a sudden, when you can't stop somebody defensively and the game gets later and later and later, it becomes a bit of a concern. Eastern Washington squeezes that one out 45-42. I think in those three losses, they look horrible, but they're really not horrible, because those three teams, we see teams move up to FBS, to the FBS level every year. A team like Charlotte, all three of these teams could pound Charlotte. All three of these teams could walk into FCS football right now and probably win 3 or 4 games. So it's not that bad as it may seem on paper. But the one that is bad is Buffalo losing to Albany. Albany is a rung below what those other teams are, maybe 2 rungs, 3 rungs. But when you take a good look at the statistics from that game, I think Lance Leipold's Buffalo team will find that they just gave one away. I mean, they had a plus 28 advantage in total plays. Buffalo ran 82 plays, Albany only 54. Buffalo gained 403 total yards, Albany only 238. Buffalo held all the statistical advantages. Albany had a couple of big plays for scores, and Buffalo, with 4 turnovers, it's very hard to win any game when you lose the plus-minus in the turnover battle by -4. They had 4, Albany had none. So that was the difference in that one. I think Buffalo is probably a little bit better than that, but give credit to Albany for being able to hang on to that victory. They didn't do much on offense, only 12 first downs, but it was enough, along with the big plays and the forced turnovers, to get themselves a win.
Rob, were there any big surprises from week 1 that we haven't hit on yet that you want to mention before we move on to some week 2 previews?
I think the biggest surprise, and nobody's surprised that Alabama won. Nobody's surprised that Alabama covered a 12-point number. But when you win by 46 points, and USC was off to a 3-0 lead in that game, and they get beat 52-3 for the remainder of the game. Pretty surprising, considering USC was top 15 coming into this game. There was a lot of chatter, a lot of hype behind this USC team, that perhaps this was the year where, with 10 returning starters on offense, that they could do some damage. The recruiting levels are back for USC. They had gone through some sanctions, but now, much like Penn State, their depth is not a concern anymore. And they were just manhandled. Rookie quarterback or freshman quarterback Jalen Hurts for Alabama came in and destroyed this team in his first appearance in a college football game. So I think, and not because they lost, Rob, and not because they didn't cover, but because they lost by 46, and the way that game just steamrolled out of control. And that game was, as soon as Alabama started scoring, it seemed like they scored every 90 seconds. So 52-6, I think a little bit of a surprise to me. Alabama consequently got a raise in the power ratings, and the other side took a little bit of a nosedive in the power ratings.
My biggest surprise was not the fact that Florida State won and covered. I think that before the weekend, if someone would have said, Florida State's going to win, that wouldn't be a big surprise. But I think what surprises me is that they were down 28-6 and absolutely dominated the back half of that game, starting with the touchdown right before the half, and then the run they went on in the third quarter. I thought Ole Miss was a better football team than that, and you've obviously adjusted your rankings down on Ole Miss accordingly. But that's just something that if you're going to be a top 10 program, if you're going to play in the SEC West and compete week in and week out, you can't be blowing a 28-6 lead.
Yeah, the last thing you expect in that situation is for one side to give up a 33-0 run. Right? I mean, it's just incredible that with the defensive ability that Ole Miss has, and granted, they've lost some pieces. We understand that, and they had a key component leave in the first half due to injury, but 33-0 just looked like a totally different Mississippi defense, looked like a totally different Florida State quarterback in Francois, and a totally different Florida State offense in the second half.
Well, Rob, I think we've said all we can say for week one. Let's jump into some week 2 games. We're not going to do these in any particular order, but let's start with South Carolina and Mississippi State. South Carolina gets a gutty 13-10 win against Vanderbilt to open the year. They didn't look very good in doing it, but they did enough to get the win nonetheless. And then Mississippi State coming off of a very surprising loss to South Alabama, 21-20. Mississippi State opening a 6.5, 7-point favorite at the moment. What are your thoughts on South Carolina, Mississippi State come Saturday?
So, well, let's start with the power rating line. The power ratings made this game Mississippi State -10, Rob, so there's a little bit of, power rating value toward Mississippi State inside that number. I would never suggest, because I never do, or at least 99% of the time I did not make a play solely based on power ratings. But when you see a little bit of a gap like that, it's smart to go in, check out the fundamentals, check out the situationals, everything, maybe some intangibles that are going on. And if you get a couple more arrows that point towards Mississippi State, then go ahead and make the play. As far as the game itself is concerned, it's huge for Mississippi State. You have back-to-back home games. You lose your opener to South Alabama. Dallas Davis, the new South Alabama quarterback, leads a couple of fourth-quarter touchdown drives. They come from behind. They win 21-20. So that's disheartening for Mississippi State. You can't lose 2 home games right off the bat. And now this is conference. It's not divisional, but it's still SEC, and it's important at the end of the season when they're looking at conference records. So I think there's a lot to play for here on the Mississippi State side. They didn't look impressive either running or throwing the football. The same can be said for South Carolina. South Carolina probably played a more difficult opponent playing Vanderbilt, played at a more difficult venue playing at Vanderbilt in that game. And this is going to be their second SEC conference game in a row. When you open the season with back-to-back conference opponents, that's pretty difficult when you have a brand-new head coach and as many defections and upheaval in personnel as South Carolina has had. But giving credit, they were still the same boring Will Muschamp offense, and I know he's not the offensive coordinator, but we all know from watching him head coach at Florida, he basically has the final say on everything. They're going to be a boring football team to watch offensively, but they did score 13 points. It did take a career-long 55-yard field goal to win that game. So give South Carolina some credit. But now you travel to Starkville against an angry team. I wonder if they can sustain that here. Situation kind of sets up for Mississippi State to get the win here. We'll see. Like I say, there's not much difference fundamentally between the two, except that Dan Mullen's offense is a little more wide open than is Will Muschamp's. And defensively, I'd probably rate Mississippi State a little bit better. They were tested by South Alabama, Sun Belt team or not. Dallas Davis is a strong-arm quarterback, and they've got some skilled players. So I probably, early in the week here, power ratings suggest it, and maybe situations suggest that Mississippi State might be a decent look in that game.
We'll move along to the Battle of Pennsylvania, so to speak. Penn State is going to play Pitt. You could say Pitt was involved in another Battle of Pennsylvania last week as they took care of Villanova by a score of 28-7. Penn State beat Kent State by 20, and both teams looked okay. Nothing spectacular, nothing too flashy. Pitt is a 6-point favorite currently in this one. What do you see, Rob?
And for those listening to the podcast here, if you want an in-depth and full analysis of the game, just go to the website, robvenosports.com. That actually is our free play for the week. I gave you a full analysis on this particular contest. We'll be somewhat brief in our talk about it here. I think that, in watching the games last week, Rob, and in assessing what these two teams might be, listen, Penn State really does want to open up their offense. Joe Moorhead, the new offensive coordinator, is a guy who likes to throw it around a lot, likes to spread people out, would rather have a power run game, which Penn State does have with Saquon Barkley. He's still their number one offensive weapon. But he's not a side-to-side bubble screen type of guy. He wants to push the ball vertically down the field. And we saw in a number of instances on Saturday in the Penn State-Kent State game that they can get receivers deep. I think the problem for them right now is, yes, quarterback Trace McSorley fits the system the best because he's got the ability to wiggle out of trouble and make some first downs and make some plays with his legs. But his arm strength is not really the quality of what they need here to push the football vertically. He underthrew multiple times open receivers downfield. It seemed to me his best throw is like the 8-yard out, where it's really accurate and it's on the money. But when you're trying to push the ball deep 5, 6, 7 times a game like Moorhead would like, and Trace McSorley is your quarterback, perhaps that's where this system will fail. We'll see if McSorley can get more accuracy with the deep ball throughout the season. It's only one game, and coaches always say the biggest difference in their teams happens between week 1 and week 2. So I'm going to keep an eye out because the Pittsburgh defense is really good, and we'll see if McSorley can make some plays deep. The other side of that, I don't know, something to consider when you're handicapping games, Rob, and a team opens. And Pittsburgh opened with a very good FCS team. Once again, Villanova picked inside the top 10. Villanova, a team predicated on defense, so maybe no surprise that Pittsburgh only got 28 points. But my question for them would be whether or not they were vanilla on offense and maybe holding back some stuff in the playbook because they knew Penn State was on deck. Remember, this is a series that hasn't been played since the year 2000. This is 15 years without these two teams meeting. So this is going to be a very, very heated football game for the next 4 years. I think they signed a 4-year deal. So you can expect emotions to run high, effort to be max level for both teams here. And I just wonder if Pittsburgh, because they ran James Conner so much and they didn't push the ball down the field at all with quarterback Nate Peterman. Hey, Villanova sat there and put 8 men in the box all day long and dared Pittsburgh to run. And they tried it, and they threw their little dink passes, and they walked away with a 28-7 victory. So maybe that's all their offense is, Rob. Maybe that's it. That's all they have. Or maybe some stuff was held back in the playbook for this Penn State game. We'll see come Saturday.
We'll keep it moving. A very unique setting for the next game we're going to talk about. They are going to play at Bristol Motor Speedway, and that would be Virginia Tech and Tennessee. Virginia Tech took care of business against Liberty 36-13. Nothing spectacular, but they won the game. Tennessee struggled mightily to beat Appalachian State, coming out on top only 20-13 and needing overtime to do it. Obviously, there's a lot of hype around the Tennessee program this year, talks of them representing the SEC East in the conference title game. So their start wasn't that great, but they have a big chance here against a quality Virginia Tech opponent out of conference. Line sitting at around 11.5, 12 points right now. Take us through this one.
Yeah, I think that if you're head coach Butch Jones and the Tennessee Volunteers, like you said earlier, they scraped by. And, boy, that's a sigh of relief because Appalachian State had them on the ropes for the entire 4 quarters. And even into overtime, Tennessee winds up escaping. And now they can move on from there. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't what the bandwagon had expected. But certainly a win is a win is a win. And it's better than, opening up with a loss to a Sun Belt team. Now you move on to Virginia Tech, who, like you said, 36-13 winners over Liberty in their opening game. And I think that's pretty good for them, right? Because, again, you're talking about a team that's undergone a major overhaul, out with Frank Beamer after 29 years, in with Justin Fuente, the more spread style, up-tempo offense. That's his forte. That's his specialty. We know what Paxton Lynch and Memphis looked like the last 2 years. That's what Virginia Tech's being converted into. So it's a heck of a conversion. They started the process a little bit last year. They tried to go to spread. Nothing like what they're in right now under Brad Cornelison at offensive coordinator. But a pretty good day. You're breaking in a new quarterback, too, JUCO transfer Gerard Evans, who was a big name at Trinity Junior College last year. Does fairly well. I think this team can only get better offensively as they go on. The fixture, the anchor, the thing that's going to hold them together is the fact that they kept Bud Foster on that coaching staff, defensive coordinator that's been there for 20-plus years now. It's all the kids have ever known at Virginia Tech, really. And they played pretty good defense against Liberty in week 1. They'll be a good opponent for Tennessee, but Tennessee has to produce something here offensively, with quarterback Dobbs and running back Hurd and Kamara and all these guys that they have. Otherwise, there'll be some questions about Tennessee. Power ratings made the game 10. The game opened 10. It's been pushed towards Tennessee. I think what people are expecting here is a Tennessee bounce back. I think Virginia Tech's getting little consideration as an opponent that would put up huge resistance, like maybe the Virginia Tech of the past in their glory time under Frank Beamer. I think people have sort of written off Virginia Tech as a top-notch challenger anymore. So that's why we see a little bit of movement here. Neutral setting, it's real hard to judge here how the teams will react, Rob, to this one. Bristol is kind of equidistant between these two campuses. So you'll get a lot of Virginia Tech travels anyway. They travel well. I think you'll fill the stands on both sides. Be an interesting game. For me, I'd like to see what Evans does at quarterback for Virginia Tech against this Tennessee defense, because he really did have a sensational year last year at Trinity Junior College. The 38 touchdown passes and only 3 interceptions. He's got a lot of talent, and we'll see if head coach Fuente can mold him this early in the season, if they can progress offensively. Once again, we don't know how much of the playbook was opened up against Liberty. You'd have to figure that the playbook is simplified at this point in time as they try and implement their system. But certainly it should be a little bit more of a threat than what Appalachian was offensively. Appalachian is basically a huge running team. You stack the run against them and force them to throw. Tennessee wasn't really able to stop Marcus Cox from running in that game. and quarterback Lamb had a pretty good game as well. So this will be interesting from both sides. We'll see if Tennessee is what they were projected to be preseason, or if week one is kind of an indication that if you put a decent opponent in front of them, they're going to struggle.
Let's move along to the holy war of college football, BYU and Utah. Utah took care of Southern Utah. Defense looked great. They didn't allow a point. Utah wins that one 24-0. BYU, I had them last week with Arizona as my kind of under-the-radar game of the week, and it ended up being a fantastic finish. Not necessarily the final score I was expecting, but BYU gets the win over Arizona 18-16, and Utah's a 3.5 point favorite in what will be a very heated game. Take us through this one, please, Rob.
Yeah, this rivalry certainly is as intense as any, right? I think if we just start to break down these teams and we start with Utah, they're probably a little bit under the radar this year, Rob. I don't think that they're getting all the credit that they deserve for being a program that now can sustain losses personnel-wise. You know, you look at them and you see 5 returning starters on offense, and you think, well, it's a down year for Utah. Lose their quarterback, lose 6 starters. Defensively, they brought back 7 guys. But what might be more important was the amount of Lettermen that returned to this team. 59 Lettermen is a huge number of guys that have been in this Kyle Whittingham system now for 1, 2, or 3 years. So Utah's a team right now that while they don't get a bunch of 4- and 5-star recruits, they are one of those teams, I think, that we can safely say reloads from year to year and reloads with system players from year to year. Kind of like what let's compare them to what Iowa is in the Big Ten. You know, Iowa's not out getting a bunch of 4- and 5-star recruits, but every year Kirk Ferentz brings in guys that fit his system, and Iowa comes out with 9 or more wins almost every year. The same type of thing going on in the Pac-12 with Utah. Good opening game for them against Southern Utah. Southern Utah, FCS team, predicted to do some pretty good things and maybe, you know, probably find their way into their 16-team playoff field and perhaps do a little bit of damage. I don't think many consider them a threat to win the national title on an FCS level, but a team that's pretty well respected this season. So good win for Utah. BYU, you know, you wouldn't expect 18-16 as a final against a Rich Rodriguez Arizona team, but Brigham Young, again, you know, these teams that have gone through system upheaval, system overhauls, probably just don't know what to expect out of them from week one. Now, I talked earlier about Bronco Mendenhall and Robert Anae being at Virginia now. That's what's left BYU to go to Virginia, and in its place, Kalani Sitake, the new head coach, nice first opening win for him, and Ty Detmer, your new offensive coordinator, who takes Anae's 85-90 play, extreme tempo, pass the football style offense, and replaces it with an NFL West Coast offense. Now they huddle up. Now they're much more methodical. Now the play calling is more pro style. And we kind of saw that in their offensive production. You expect BYU to be 30-plus, especially with Taysom Hill back at quarterback, Tanner Mangum backup quarterback, in real good shape there. But they only produced 18 points against what's not a very good defense, and, in fact, a defense that had changed systems this year in Arizona. So I think that Brigham Young potentially is, even though there's good personnel there, I think there's a learning curve with that system, and Utah's defense is good enough to keep them quiet. This will be a good game. This will be a real good game because BYU's defense played extremely well in that opener against a wide-open Arizona team. I think the line is right. Power ratings suggested the same numbers, so I think the line is in a good place. But it's a good test for both sides here, and I just think Utah is a little bit disregarded or sold short by the general betting public.
I think the last game we're going to touch on before we'll throw out a few wild card games is Arkansas and TCU. If you look at the top 25 this week, there's really no huge matchups where a top 25 team looks like there's a big shot at an upset. You're talking a lot of 4 or 5 touchdown spreads for a lot of these top 25 teams. But here's one with Arkansas and TCU where TCU a little bit smaller of a favorite, 7.5, 8 points. They took care of business against South Dakota State, 59-41. The offense looked really good. Probably would like to see a little better play out of the defense. And you look at the Arkansas team, they escape Louisiana Tech with a touchdown late in the fourth quarter, come away with a 21-20 victory. Their defense looked good. The offense looked a little bit out of sync. What do you see as these two teams meet down in Texas on Saturday night?
Well, and again, for TCU, Rob, South Dakota State is no joke as an FCS team. This is one of your top 10 teams. They come from the Missouri Valley Conference, which is the best FCS football conference. That honor used to go to the Colonial, but now it certainly goes to the Missouri Valley. They're absolutely loaded. And South Dakota State made a good showing for themselves offensively. Couldn't stop TCU defensively whatsoever. That's a good sign for the Horned Frogs, who broke in Kenny Hill, former Texas A&M quarterback, as their quarterback after the transfer this season. TCU is an intriguing team because the opinions on them were mixed. The opinions were either they're sliding in the Big 12 or they're still right up the top of the Big 12, and they'll push for a Big 12 championship this year. I think for those who believe that TCU has the ability to push for a Big 12 title this year, they're banking on a lot of injuries suffered by Texas Christian last year that returns to this lineup this year. Remember last year, their defense went through, I don't think I can remember a team that suffered as many key injuries as TCU did last year. I mean, by the fourth week of the season or third week of the season, they were just decimated, and they couldn't stop anybody. They had to be able to score because they just couldn't play defense. Now, a lot of those guys are back. They've got a ton of talent because the young guys who were forced to play early last year have all that experience under their belts, and now the returning guys who were starters to begin with before injury are there. I think TCU's got a real chance. I'm in the kind of the support bandwagon here. I support the fact that TCU has a chance to win that league. The defensive numbers weren't great, but they did gain 662 total yards, outgained South Dakota State by 201. Once again, South Dakota's a team that'll push the ball all over the field. So, they're a difficult type of team to defend. Arkansas was another question or another story entirely, but I think Brett Bielema will put it best that you remember last year, Arkansas was in that same type of game at home against Toledo. And that was a game where weather delayed the contest in the third quarter. And when they came back to play, Toledo had a couple of scores, and Toledo won straight up a very low-scoring game. And that kind of stunned Arkansas. Here, at least, they hung on and won the football game against Louisiana Tech. I think it says more about Louisiana Tech and their maybe too-soon reported demise. A lot of people off of that Louisiana Tech bandwagon thinking that they're not going to be as potent in CUSA this year because of all the personnel that they lost. But Skip Holtz showed right away, and all the Arkansas player quotes, a little bit of a newfound respect for Louisiana Tech after battling with them for 4 quarters. So I don't think it's an indictment of Arkansas, the fact that they only won by 1 point. I think it's more of a positive for Louisiana Tech. This will be a good contest for TCU. It's a different kind of offense that their defense will be facing here. Rather than South Dakota spread all over the field, you get Arkansas's more contained play-action style passing offense. quarterback Allen looked pretty good, Rob. I don't know how much of the game you got to see, but he's replacing his brother, Brandon Allen, at quarterback. And, boy, he looked pretty good. So I think the pieces are still there for Arkansas. But I really like TCU, and this number has jumped. I think it opened 7, and you just said the current is 8.5. So there's been some money on the TCU side. But, like I said, I don't want to sell Arkansas short real fast because I think that result last week was more due to the fact that Louisiana Tech is better than people were giving them credit for heading into the season.
Well, Rob, that's all the big games that I had kind of keyed for us to talk about. There are some other ones out there. Is there any game that we haven't touched on that might kind of be an under the radar game for you this week in terms of whether it's a good play on the spread, or you think it'll be a fun game to watch, or you think it might be able to really tell us something about one of the two teams?
Well, let's say this. I'll give you one that I'm surprised at, Rob, and I'm surprised at the amount of money early on this week that's come in on Wake Forest. Wake Forest is a team that I actually expect, as the year goes on, will be a good point spread team. But in order to be a good point spread team and a money-making point spread team, you have to have good point spread situations. And they just weren't involved in a good point spread situation in week 1. They were heavy chalk against Tulane. And we talked earlier about how Tulane has undergone a significant offensive system change under Willie Fritz, converting to the triple option. But Wake Forest laying 16.5 is never a good play, and it wasn't a good play on opening day because they only won that game 7-3. They're playing Duke here, I believe, and if you're looking at it right now, because I'm not, but I believe that this game has been bet down from Duke -7 to Duke -4.5, and Duke's at home here. And I really question the line move here and wonder why, because Duke, a team that lost their starting quarterback, 5-6 days before the season started, right? Thomas Sirk went down for the year and really set the Duke people reeling. I know that the fan base, even the coaching staff for that matter, a little bit concerned, but the one person that wasn't real concerned, head coach David Cutcliffe. The backup here is a kid named Daniel Jones, redshirt freshman, dual threat quarterback, because in Cutcliffe's offense now, a dual threat quarterback really runs it best. That's why Sirk was so good, because Sirk has real running ability. But Daniel Jones is a guy they've nicknamed already the future. He comes in against North Carolina Central. You know, they're the best team in the MEAC, but the MEAC is not a strong FCS league, so it wasn't a top-notch opponent. But they win this game 49-6, and it was impressive because Daniel Jones, for the limited amount of time he played, went 10 of 15 for 189 yards, and he ran twice for a 14-yard average, total 28 yards. And after the game, in listening to some David Cutcliffe quotes, he was all smiles, and he just looked at the news reporters and said, "I told you the kid could run, and I told you the kid was good." They have a lot of faith in this guy, Rob, and I don't think, you don't know it until you see it. Losing Sirk had me believing that Duke went from a team in the Coastal Division that could be trouble for the top contenders in that division to a team that maybe wasn't going to be any sort of threat whatsoever. Now with Jones, I think you have to change your opinion, even if it was only one game against North Carolina Central. So it surprises me that off of that effort, that people would still bet Wake Forest so heavily here. I don't see it that way. I think that at this point in time, you've got real good value on the Duke side. Power ratings make this game Duke -12. Bettors have taken it from 7, even further away from that 12, now to 4.5. So remember the name, Daniel. They call him the future down there at Duke, Daniel the Future Jones. He could be a name we're talking about a lot for the upcoming weeks on this podcast.
Well, Rob, that will do it for week 2 look at games. We have one more mailbag question from one of our listeners, and it's an interesting question after what we saw Alabama do to USC on Saturday night. What will be the smallest line in an Alabama game this season?
Well, we need their opponents list. Let me see here. Let's get an Alabama schedule up and see if we can't figure out what that would be. Who would be their top? I guess their top.
Probably Ole Miss or LSU road games, I would think.
Yeah, and I was going to say LSU, so let's go with that. Let's say that LSU is the top opponent that they'll face for the remainder of the year. That game is on the road, so right now I would make Alabama in that contest a 6-point favorite according to power ratings. So there you have it. That would be the least. If you want to know what the highest would be, I guess we would have to look to Chattanooga, right? Chattanooga is a FCS team, and that game's actually at home second to last week of the year. That's an interesting way that the SEC has chosen to schedule now. We saw it last year, Rob, where they put one of those FCS cupcakes the week prior to their season finale. Looks like they're doing that again. But if you want to take that game, for instance, in that one right now, I show them to be a 41.5-point favorite. That would be the largest number this year. Maybe Kent. In fact, Kent would probably be a hair bit higher, Rob. Kent looks like they would be about a 44-point underdog. But it's a difficult SEC schedule, obviously, thrown on there. Besides at LSU, you got at Mississippi, at Tennessee. A lot of good teams involved there for Alabama. But I think that's the cheapest number on week one. By the time they get to the LSU game, could be a lot more than 6.5, or 6. But right now it would show up as Alabama on the road -6 over LSU. And I think that if we polled 100 people that bet college football right now, all 100 would willingly lay the 6 with Alabama off of what they saw last week.
Let's talk about the Alabama quarterback situation really quickly while we're on them. They put a true freshman into the game after the offense did nothing in the first quarter, and that's not something Nick Saban normally would do. He did it. It paid big dividends. Is he the quarterback moving forward for this team, do you think?
Yeah, I think Jalen Hurts will be the quarterback moving forward. Now, that doesn't mean that as the starter, he'll play every offensive series these next couple of weeks. I still think there'll be a slight bit of rotation. If he does perform the way he did against USC, then I think maybe by the 4th week of the season, 5th week of the season, you won't see anybody but Jalen Hurts anymore. The true freshman quarterback. Boy, he showed a lot of poise, Rob, in that game, and he showed a very good throwing arm, pretty decent accuracy. He can run and create plays with his legs, so I think the multi-purpose angle to him, or multi-threat angle to him, certainly is better than the quarterbacks that they have on the roster right now. Against Western Kentucky this week, we'll probably see a little bit of a rotation again with Hurts as the starter, and maybe I take that back after this Western Kentucky game if Hurts performs well again. When you go to Mississippi, I don't know if you want to go there with a dual quarterback system, so maybe Nick Saban makes his decision cut and dry after this week's game against WKU.
Well, Rob, that is it from the mailbag for this week, and if anybody has a question, they were listening to the podcast this week, they can email robvenosports@gmail.com, and we'll do our best to take a few questions each and every week on the show. Any final thoughts or parting words, Rob?
Yeah, I would say this, just as words of wisdom, being in the industry so long, to those of you out there that are betting these games, don't hang your hats on everything that you saw in week one. There's a lot of variables between week 1 and week 2. We covered a lot of them, Rob, from teams holding stuff back in their playbook because there's a bigger fish to fry on deck, which would be this week, from teams not necessarily being cohesive out of the gates, but gaining that cohesiveness in week 2. We see it year in and year out. This is usually, in fact, I won't even say usually, this is the week. Week 2 is the week of overreaction as far as point spread numbers are concerned in college football. Some of the overreaction will be correct, but more than 50% of it, the majority of it, will be incorrect. So just be careful. Do your research when you handicap your plays and put yourself in the best position to win. This is a difficult week for guys who haven't handicapped for a long time to handicap.
Well, Rob, I think the best thing that anybody could do if they're looking to handicap these games this weekend is get over to RobVenoSports.com. Lots of great information there, from power rankings and great weather reports as kickoff approaches at sites throughout the country this weekend. RobVenoSports.com is the place to go for all of your information and, of course, your handicapping selections. I'm Rob O'Connor for RobVenoSports.com. We appreciate the time as always, Rob, and we will be back to do it again next week. Thank you very much.